Frank B. Wilderson III is an Afro-pessimist who hails from the Minnesotan area. Most people don't know his backgrounds, folks, upper middle class. If I'm not mistaken, his people worked at the university. Dartmouth graduate. I think he's a legacy baby. And those things definitely contribute to a perspective, one's language, one's exposure to particular literature, as well as life experiences, right? A lot of people like to warrant that upper middle class African Americans and or black people do not suffer the same way. Within this lecture, we'll address some of those claims about what suffering is in the context of Afro-pessimism, and we'll talk about a concept called the grammar of suffering, or grammars of suffering. But back to Wilderson. Wilderson is noted for, I guess at this time, his second book, but his first book, Incognito, is memoir-based, rather, it's like autobiographical to a degree. I won't get the camera because I know Frank likes to give a disclaimer. All of it's not real, but it could be if it needed to be, and if it isn't, then it's not. But with that being the case, some of the details that are in the book give you a very vivid description about the theory. Right? Frank, he discusses this concept of an antithesis, right? Most people at a doctoral level believe in the thesis, and you need to have a thesis that provides a solution, right? That's the thing of academia instead, right? Like this is the academic push, this is the resolve. Most people with PhDs will tell you right now, they had to write some long ass paper that had a conclusion about solutions to things, right? These solutions and conclusions are like premeditated or very scripted ways to look at and analyze things, but should come up with a conclusion nevertheless. Frank thinks that this is a problem of current day academia, right? And this is how he even posits his academic discussion, which is, yeah, we probably shouldn't draw all these conclusions because what do we know if we haven't figured out the problem yet? But with that being the case, it's that antithesis basis is one in which we look at how he's criticizing an organization of thought, right? When we talk about academic discussions, we're talking about just that, discussions that are historic inside of scholarly deposits, right? Like these people who are writing things, right? And they're writing things in a particular line or a particular conversation. And so Frank he has jumped into a conversation, and this is what we'll discuss. His antithesis is just the beginning of how he opposes himself or posits himself in this discussion. Right? And so once we look at some of the very political work, Frank becomes a political activist in some sorts, right? Some sorts meaning some people call him a terrorist, some people call him a political activist. I call him a political activist. And it was some of the work that he did in South Africa with organizations that, because I'll tell you the truth about what happened, maybe not, then you'll go find out the organizations and their specific names yourself. But he was responsible for a lot of the political organizing that was able to weed out outsiders that were able to basically politically control and put Nelson Mandela in power. Right? Like he was with Winnie and her political organization and how they were organizing for the folks who were basically endemic to the land, right? Like who were native to the land. And these folks were having political struggles about controlling space in their country. When Frank came in as an American, if you knew anything at the time, any one of us could be spotless, no matter what we look like, how brown we could be, how African, how whatever culture that they may have, we look like that, we could still be traitors. And everybody cautious about political intent, right? And so Frank was also a part of organizations that dealt with traitors in specific. And this is where, besides some of his creative writing degree, you see some of his flowery language take to appeal. Besides, you know, his general study of black rhetoric. But when we get further down or deep into the theory, some of the things that gets discussed in Incognito is this concept of a black subject. Right? Most people are like, what is that? Right? Well, Wilderson has a real big, quarrel, academic, beef, if you will, with Gramsci. You just look out, there's a problem here. Right? He doesn't think that all subjectivity, meaning all what is to be assumed in a larger academic discussion of modernism, postmodernism, is this subject, is this entity or being, right? Like, we're going to simplify some of this. They assume that every entity is the same, right? Has the same access to being recognized by what is considered the public. We'll discuss the public in-depthly, but we're right now on the subject, right? The subject is one that gets recognized, one that has voice, one that has movement, one that has meaning, one that has feel, right? This means that this subject has capacity, right? The ability to in very limiting ways, but capacity means in a very ontological, ontological is, I guess we can get into that, that's later on too, because Wilderson has a very specific ontological discussion. But how we map ourselves, how we exist, right? Wilderson talks about this question of positioning. Right? Positioning gives us a perspective on how Wilderson has a very abstract discussion. Abstract meaning not isolated incident, but a paradigm, study of paradigms, right? Like, anybody heard of Wilderson in a paradigmatic analysis? Something of the sort, right? Well, what they're talking about is not structural violence in specific, like, we think all structural violence is the same, right? No. And structural violence we can describe this in very multiple ways, right? Like, structural violence could be, oh, you have been discriminated against because you live in a particular area, right? Like a structural impedance, right? Like a structure is possible that is oppressing you, right? Or is in direct contestation with your existence in some capacity, right? Structural violence, right? I'm giving you a very tactical way to utilize some of these terms. But Wilderson disagrees with the idea that we all have access to structural violence the same way and that we suffer in the same, like same ways, right? No, we don't, right? And then says that there's a common phrase that folks should like to use that gives you I guess a flavor to this, which is oppression Olympics, right? When it's, you can't say, my oppression is worse than yours, right? Wilderson directly challenges that thesis and says, nah, hold up, it's important to place positioning where it is. We like to be liberals when we say we should not do that, but it's a way in which we demonstrate how we can be void of blackness, right? Blackness meaning that particular, like when we say subject, right? Wilderson says that there's positions that are taken that are not taken, not meaning you're not actively taking that, right? Like it's a question of taken meaning you just are upon or king, queen, right? Position taken, right? That some identifiable positions are not subjects, but they're objects, right? Objects meaning you are a subject to one's control, direct existence. You do not control your own capacity, right? The discussion of the slave is an example of this. It's not the only one, but it's an example of this, right? The discussion that Wilderson has with Orlando Patterson, for example, is reviving this concept of a slave in a historical concept or context, but then also in a contemporary positioning context. Anybody know what I mean by that? That's a whole bunch of language. You do? What do I mean?
I guess Wilderson says that the structure that causes the condition of blackness is one that's founded in civil society, which is like what we're founded upon. And I think he says specifically that like America was born in the death of the slaves. And so when he talks about the position,
it's not a question of born in, it's born of. So when we discuss this, right? Like when we discuss the position of the slave, Orlando Patterson reminds us that every democracy had slaves. Every democracy had slaves. If this is true, then a structural possibility of a society was dependent on your ability to have slaves, right? Right? That's the structural position you're talking about. Right? When we get to this, it's a question of, this is why, right, like, we're like kind of like shining out this question of structural violence, right? Because it's a question of, do we get to position ourselves? Now, blackness is a fault of history, right? A fault of colonial project that people explored upon, that created a whole other ontology, if they allow it to register. Yes?
I'm sorry I didn't ask this like 2 minutes ago, but could you go through the way in which you define blackness again?
Okay, so I'll give you my immediate debate response, like, whoop, hold up. My debate response is, blackness can't be definable. It is a trajectory in which we can take or condition in which people suffer. Right? That's my debate response, right? I'm immediate with it. It is a condition or trajectory. It's not a question of you have a culture, a flag, a particular mode of action. That doesn't exist for blackness. It's all mimicked, right? Like, I used to have a poem that discussed a lot of this when it says that, you know, they had to taxidermy the Negro, right? And then map it on to them like they are chemically induced in the lab. That's how they got their blackness, not from their mom or their dad, but from something that they mixed and did and spelled on BET and said that's how we got our news, right? It's a question in which blackness is not something that we can like position and say, hey, here's what it is, right? Blackness is always the void, right? According to some of the valuing or the economic or the positioning that gets from Lacan and some of the basis from, you know, that Wilderson is pulling from, he says that it's a question of the one that sets the tone, right? He believes in the same Du Boisian trajectory that blackness is what makes white labor possible, right? Like it's what sets society, like what is on top of, like what is, like, you know, blackness is built off of, let's say the oil, right? That makes the motor run. Let's say it's the same thing that gives, you know, access to earth, right? Carbon. It's the same things that we forget that make it possible, right? But that sustains or allows for a question of monumentalizing one's ability to even build or be civil, right? We had another hand? No? Okay. Yes.
When you gave your debate answer, the last word of your phrase was suffering?
Yes.
Thank you. Just making sure I heard you right.
Yes. Because when we get to the question of suffering, it's a grammar in which we're talking about, a very structural possibility. It's not one in which, you know, feeling is induced, right? Like Wilderson would say that that feeling that you may have, the feeling that I may love my daughter, or the feeling that I may kiss my wife, or the feeling that I may have when I fail on a test, right? That's a feeling that is of a subject, right? You can be honored, right? Your honorable, like, you know, redemption, your capacity is one is of a subject and not an object. You're not a table, right? You're not a thing to be demanded. You're not a position to be at a back door, says Carter G. Woodson, right? Like it's not one of those things. It's I can have the voice. I am present in my public. Right? When we discuss what a public is, we have to refer back to the European understanding that a public has always already been something that's opposed or a part of a structural possibility of a medieval society, right? And since then, every European society had a public, right? A public is either a square in which we can honor ourselves, right? Like it's where you can voice your commands, right? Or it's a question of where you can start public disturbance, right? When you're made an example of in your public, it is right here that you're found, right? Like they put you in a post, you're in front of everyone, right? And who demands that public? Anyone know? Who demands the public?
We're trying to generate change.
Really? That's funny. Who demands the, like, who controls the public? You know? You still know?
People in power.
Who's the people in power? Let's be specific. Who's the people in power? Right, like we're talking about, you know, medieval Europe at this time. Who's the people in power?
The king, the monarchy,
What are they using as demonstrations of their power?
generally public execution.
What else? I mean, like what, all right, so you're kind of close. What allows them to say public execution is okay?
Their power. The law.
Yes. Say it again.
The law.
Right. The law is the demonstration of power. It's not a question of whether I can kill you. The law said I can kill you. The law made that possible, but did you submit to the law? Right. A very philosophical, you know, discussion that happens within law and legal theory is social contract. Right. Like, what is a social contract? Right? A lot of this is how your citizens become in relationship to larger publics or government. Right? These social contracts allow you to say, hey, when you were born, you abide by all of these rules, right? And you can be judged by them same rules, right? This is how we get our courts, right? That's a form of a public, right? A direct public, right? But all of these things are possible, right? When Mills talks about how this social contract is related to this public, it's a power demonstration, right? We agreed to a public that, for example, every person of color in here was not included in it originally. Every woman was not thought of in it originally, right? But that's the kind of public that our social contract relates us to here in America. This is not exclusive to the world because there's demonstrations either through Orlando Patterson or some of Sexton's work that anti-blackness is global. So it's not a question of it being just demonstrated historically, but it's a question of if we can find it in America, and America's everywhere, then anti-blackness is everywhere. Very basic. It can be proven and demonstrated in multiple forms, and there's two discussions in which we can be able to appeal to this question of anti-blackness. We'll get to some of these other claims a little bit later to tell a larger story, but I need you to get some of the basics. Right? We need our basics to be able to do some extravagant business. Right? Anti-blackness at its core is the discussion originally coming from just how, funny enough, how sub-Saharan Africans were discussing their relationships to a lot of their skin color problems, right? The northern folks, white Arabs, right? You have some Eritrean problems. I mean, these things were coming into play where how they were discussing politics were anti the darker people, right? It's like, dang, how come you don't like us? That's kind of crazy. I'm you, but a couple shades darker, and you're like, not loud, not cool. And some of these discussions were happening broad, right? Because then it became an evaluating situation where your nation could be put over mine because mine was considered the darker one, the lesser one, right? The backwards one. From some other standards that are external to Africa. John Henry Clark makes this very clear. We also have Chancellor Williams as a historian making it very clear that some of those pigmentocracies, right, like the way in which we judge skin color, were not endemic to an African demonstration. Right? It was outsiders who had that particular power demonstration. But when we look at anti-blackness, that's core, right? That has evolved into discussing how that mode of demonstration is very physical, right? Has become ingrained in ways that are no longer just physical, right? Like, they are on so many levels that we can discuss them. But the way in which they get capitulated with the theory, twofold. One, negrophobic. Two, negrophiliac. Right? Wilderson in his Irvine lecture says that these are normally attuned to gender demonstrations. And so when we see, yes?
It was
Negrophiliac. To be in love with. But he said that these two demonstrations, one, negrophobic was normally reserved for the male of the black object, right? And the female the otherwise, right? It's a direct question or correlation for him as how he relates to gender. Right? We know that this is not always exclusive, and he kind of like puts a caveat next to that claim, which is it is not exclusive that this demonstration happens because of the relationship, and he doesn't wholeheartedly believe this, but the relationship that blackness is interpreted as something that is not stable in its sexual orientation, but as Sexton concludes, this is why the violence that is done to blackness is a sexual violence nevertheless. That blackness is a queer existence because it's not stable, it is not definable, right? This is the very thesis of what we understand what queerness is, but it's not demonstrated as such because it is a subjectivity that queerness can be revived and blackness cannot. That is the difference, right? It functions like, but not exactly, right? And these are some of the transient spaces that blackness exists in because of the demonstration of the slave, right? We're back to this, right? If we're going to, for example, the Caribbean islands, we're looking at sugar plantations, right? Like we're looking at rum, distributors and, industries, right? These kind of slaves were ones that were disposable quickly because twofold. One, you had to teach them, right? Because producing sugar was not producing tobacco, right? Producing tobacco, grow it, move it out, ship it, that's what it is. Pick the cotton, pick it off, we're good, we're good, we're good, right? Sugar required a particular technique. Right? It is most noted in North America. They said that were slaves weren't taught. Right? It's like not here, and for very tactical reasons. Right? Like sugar was just hard to grow. Right? Like you had to use particular growing techniques, and depending on your colonizer, you had to know when you were taught to grow sugar. So, for example, the British were the last. They learned it from the Dutch and basically innovated that particular process. But the Spanish already had it. Right? Depending on who you were enslaved by, it dictated your access to growing sugar, but literally, those islands were mass producing. Right? A lot of people say, well, yes, there were white slaves. This is normally the very ahistorical answer to Wilderson. Right? There were white slaves, right? Like blackness doesn't have a hold on the kind of subjectivity that slavery may compel. In this instance, that's non-unique because what they consider white slaves in this region weren't slaves. They were transient beings who got to choose after their servitude and move from island to island if they survived. Right? Meaning, if you lasted long enough, you ate good, you were good. Right? But that was a hard process, no doubt. Hard process. Right? This is the same qualm that Wilderson has with Karl Marx, for example. Right? How they define what the slave is. Right? Like Karl Marx is like, hey, the slave and his handy-dandy notebooks. Right? If you read Marx's notebooks, it's not none of his main work, but his notebooks, his workbooks. Right? His discussion is one in which it's like, yo, the worker has the dilemma of always finding meaning for one's labor. Right? They always have to go out and find a job. The slave is already guaranteed a job. Right? Because they are labor. Right? Primitive capital. Right? Like the very basis of the essence, right? Like you need certain things to create other modes of labor. This is why, W. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction concludes, once again, black labor makes white labor possible. Right? You have no master without slaves. Like what are you going to master of without slaves? This is why you had, even in those regions, poor whites were farmers. Their competition methods, they was upset. Man. What? Because even you see in these, you see in the Caribbean islands, and even further south, mulattoes, right, had a particular position where they can own slaves. But this was the ultimate demonstration, mulattoes, meaning mixed, I can't spell very well. There we go. Right, it's considering of a mixing, right? They're never really specific, because if you are very specific, then their term mulatto actually doesn't make sense, right? Because mixing of what? Right? We can have a mixing of native and black. We can have mixing of, native and white. They're not considered mulatto, right? And then you have like the mixing between, of course, the black and the slave. and the question of the master, and that's the only thing that's considered allowed, right? Because it's a particular positionality that is assumed to be given a subject position. Right? Like you can now hold power. No, you can't. You can control other slaves. Like that is what your job is. Right? In a North American context, we see this again with like slavers, right? Like anybody see what's it? The Django? Anybody see that recently? What was the role that Django played when he went to Candyland?
Slave.
Huh? Yeah, he was a slave. What was the role of a slave? What did he do? He just was like walking, he was the good guy, he was chilling. Like what was the role that he had to act like when he's going his way to Candyland? Proper? I remember him having to watch like dogs rip apart his man's in a tree. That's proper.
Different movie about a guy that got kidnapped and then
yeah, but that was like 12 years of slavery. I was like, oh, we could all the slavery ones mixed up. Oh, no shots, no shots, no shots. I don't like none of them anyway. It's true. And it's like, come on, really? We always get caught? How did I get here? We always get caught. Whatever. But back to the theory, right? Like, the idea in Candyland was that, Jamie Foxx was a slaver. The slaver was a particular positionality. We see this even in the movie Sankofa, that had a loyalty to one's job because it was their existence, not one in which they actually had the freedom or the capacity to make those decisions without consequence of their life. Right? This is some of the properties of what is a slave. Right? Regardless of the power position that they're associated with. Right? Like my master's richer than yours. That was a kind of understanding when they had their freedom time. Whatever you like, excuse you. I don't want to do that. But the slave had multiple roles to play. That don't mean that any of them was in any position of power, with the exception of demonstrating on top of another slave. Talking about this inside of a debate context, when they say, I am a slave, you should laugh at that. It's like, really? No, you hold a slave-like subject position, and all of you people of color who don't consider yourself black, that might be a dangerous thing to say, including all the, white people, their positions as well. That is a difficult argument to chew off. You are a slave, right? That's a common thing that gets said inside of Wildersonian debates. You're a slave, and you're like, oh, that's the land. That's wild, right? We should rethink those. It's not that you're a slave, but slave position or slave positioning is a thing. Like you just have to admit that it's a truth inside of the debate round, and then show how it is like how the relationship is shared with the affirmative if you're negative, and then show how this may be relevant if you're affirmative. Like either way, you do not call your competitors or the people you're standing in line with a slave, because I know from personal experience that can be, I guess to make a joke inside of it, a little antagonistic, if you will. We're going to pause on the storytelling just a tad bit and go for some concepts. Abstraction. Do we have paradigmatic analysis? Right, this is the level in which we're surveying what has happened, not just specific random historical events and or isolated incidents. Right, like we're studying the paradigm of the power structure that makes it possible. Right, like that is what we're seeking to provide and or analyze when we say paradigmatic analysis. Right, like we're looking at things that shape power structures, that shape realities and lived experiences and or trajectories. Here we go. When we move on, we have what is a subject, what is an object. We also should have this concept of gratuitous violence. Anybody know what that is? Not you. Yes.
Violence for the sake of violence.
I like that. Yeah, violence for the sake of violence. Can we get some more? Yeah.
Violence that no longer has utility.
Explain that a little bit.
As in, there's no, my understanding, and this is mostly a question, I don't even know why I asked the answer.
That's right.
My understanding is that there's no benefit anymore from the violence, so it's
No, violence is profitable. What do you mean?
well,
Right, like the question of like desegregation was profitable, but that was very violent to the black community. So like, violence has always been profitable. Like gratuitous violence has been the nature, right? Like in which violence happens, right? It's responding to, for the sake of violence, no, right? It's a project. Know that it's a project. This is why we're talking about it in political terms. This is why I get brought up in debate, right? Like when we're talking about what is that gratuitous violence is one that is always already going to happen. Right, like Wilderson says, it's not a question of if, just a question of when. It's like, wow, okay. Right, that's how we determine the violence. This is one of the reasons why the impact debates inside of K-debate right now is happening the way they are, because the demonstration of gratuitous violence versus, oh, your act happens one time? Oh, word, if I can prove that these kind of links are not just systemic, right, but every time you localize a symbolic gesture, my skin color is violent, right? This is why, like, when we talk about its existence, I never have to feel like what a lynching feels like. But I know if I see that hanging from a tree, I'm gonna feel like, oh my God, right? It'll shake a chord. Like my historical memories leaching out to it. Not because I know it's something that happened in the past, but you all close your eyes and I'm in the wrong part of the country, it can happen again and again and again. Right? And in different ways, right? This is why we're able to spot the kind of, not just isolated incident that localizes, for example, Emmett Till. It's the same kind of logic that allows us to link Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin. It's the same kind of logic that allows us to link, what is it, I mean, we can keep naming how the violence happens, right? Like I can strip away names and say, my homeboy who died in front of, you know, my high school. Or the little girl who, you know, like basically got knocked into a coma because of the same kind of violence. It's not just police and we stop and frisk, right? That's an isolated incident or a demonstration of this kind of gratuitous violence, right? But it's not an act of gratuitous violence. It's how we're able to mark that, right? Me and my partner used to say, symbolic violence outweighs material violence because symbolic violence makes material violence possible. Round statement. You should say it all the time. Because it was how we evaluated, right? And this is how the paradigmatic analysis allowed us to evaluate the positioning of each coded body, right? Dr. Shanari Brinkley talks about the demonstration of anti-blackness in the debate space when she says we're tattooed to our performances, right? Because you know, when you have the little kids of color stand up, right? And regardless of whether you know them, as long as they're not the World's or Debate's junior partners, you're going to expect a framework debate on the other side. It's like, whoa, 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 hold up, pause, right? These are questions in which, why did you think that? Because you see that we got speakers in the front of the room, right? Why did you think that, right? Because you heard rap music from the front of the room? Why did you think that? Because I got locks that demonstrate a particular culture, which Wilderson don't believe, right? But these are symbolic markers. Right, like it used to be baggy jeans, blue jeans, you know what I'm saying? Like the coordinated, police description. White tee, blue jeans, they're very baggy and some kind of Nike/Jordan sneaker. Now the description has changed to probably a fitted t-shirt, jeans, and a Jordan sneaker. Right, these same kind of police descriptions sections talk about, right, was it Anthony Paul Farley discusses, him and his wife, discuss about how these markings, right, that are identified the targeting mechanisms allows us to be able to pinpoint that kind of violence to be very specific to positionings, right? We see the same kind of demonstration when we say, hey, we're going to send the natives to boarding school, but we're going to release those Negroes, niggers, and or blacks, darkies, whatever you want to call them, horse monkeys, right, throw it all in the gambit, right? Those people to work either on our farms or into servitude, basically, again. Right? Or be destitute for jail. We see this in Angola, right? Their prisons don't change. They're still on horseback today with guns, and they're working plantations. Right? Doesn't change. Right? Because we see how this demonstration happens, it's like targeting for today, policing mechanisms then are still policing mechanisms now. We say, that's not true. Not true. Even if you don't, yes.
What Wilderson say that like they are the same like employment? It's the same mechanism they get employed. They just get employed more covert forms.
This is why you can never quote Wilderson to identify his own impacts. You quote the people that he cites to give you better reach or result, which is Anthony Buffarelli talks about the discussion of white over black and the perfection of that system. It's white over black and white over black only. Right? And so when you talk about it has a thesis, yes, it is rooted in those demonstratable tools, but they perfect themselves in order for the ultimate containment or control of the purpose of the public. Right? We look at Du Bois's work, and he talks about how after they abolished the transatlantic slave trade, inter-American slave trade was booming, it was popping. Right? There's an example of like Virginia, for example, being the population, right, like the boomers of their slave, trading, right? Like they were producing. They would have all of these women camps, maybe 5 males to 20 women, plantations of maybe 100 to 200, right? You do the math. And then they would have those women circling in and out. That's all they would do, is procreate. Give them one. Over and over and over again. If you were the lucky meaning unlucky, slave woman who just couldn't produce, any of the studs who were on the farm, they would put out an all-call. This all-call would look like, I am farmer, blah, 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 and I have a wonderful, wonderful slave who cannot produce any testicles. I will pay you testicles. Right? This means to just basically have intercourse with this woman. They will have folks who will come in, throw humongous parties on Sunday right after church. Come over, she can't produce, put her in a room, and they take turns. Right? That same kind of manipulation, we know that that happens in public because we learned through Aldrich Cleaver's story that black women were rapeable legally until when? Somewhere around 1969. And that's a reach. Because we know that through the state's counter plan, each state implements their own interpretation of that same law. And we know, if we're getting specific, municipalities do a better job at that interpretation game, so it happens again. Like, smaller the town, the luckier you may not be. Right? But this demonstration is one in which that gratuitous violence is through the same narrative. Right? It's not that it's the same body, but that position can be demonstrated over and over again. We can see this with Sarah Bartman. This is all the Sharp and Whiting work that talks about how, Sarah Bartman was a French artist, right? Like put on stage behind these bar curtains because of her humongous hips. It was how African she looked, how exotic she was. It's very eerie how, for example, black women have to exhibit this same thing when they get on stage, how naked they have to be, how curvy they must be in order to be accepted. Sounds very, very strange. Right. That same kind of violence that we can recognize or hear, I can find her over again when we see how she's demonstrated inside of the 1920s when we send all our men to war, but black women were already working in factories for Rosie the Riveter, right? It's the thing that we're showing all of these posters, right? Because that's what it means to be an American woman. Like, that black woman wasn't already in those factories working them same jobs for half the price. Maybe even 3/5, I don't know, right? But that's the question in which we're able to discuss those, right? Like, because of the paradigm, we're able to not map those as isolated incidents or markings in history, and that just happened, right? It's a question of looking at a kind of violence that can be demonstrated, whether it be phobic or philiac, to how we remove blackness from its study. This past was a high school topic, the Latin America business, right? It's like, wow, that whole topic was anti-black. Right? Because every country we decided to explore in, we never said, where are your black people? And in fact, most of those countries' interpretation of what blackness is the removal of African. Just like Wilderson says, you know, he went on to go African, he came off black. Bye-bye. Wow, that NATO alienation that Orlando Patterson talks about happened again when you interpret your whole nation. Sexton talks about this when he says it's the question of a multiracialism, right? A project of multiracialism where we align the whole world for a project of brownness, which is the direct void of like blackness, right? Like it's the absolute dereliction, right? Like we can get to Fanon and his question of violence and blackness because he talks about this in a very colonial context. But he's seeing like the literal, like, oh, we were enslaved, okay, cool, this is like neo-slavery. And it's like, wow, look at that again. And we're having to fight for the same things in a language that's not ours, right? Nubia Thiago talks about how that language is destructive to these colonial bodies because they are non-existent of themselves, meaning they don't have an authentic version of their being because they're mapped by a sovereign nation, a particular language that's not theirs, or a colonial or imperial project, like English. Like we can go back to the language is Nubia's thing. He says that that's important to map how native alienation or the robbing of or the stripping from one's native lands, right, and displaced and taught to be rebuilt. That project is one that is always violent. And to remind one of such is also a demonstration of the second kind of violence, which is a dishonorable subject. Right, like the dishonorable subject is one in which that capacity or lack thereof, it is always at the foot. Right, this is where the slave narrative comes in. Right, this is where Wilderson is stealing, his concept of what is a slave. Orlando Patterson is talking about there are components to making a slave. Right, and one of them is NATO alienation, to strip it from its land. Like you have no access, no direct access, no claim, none. Right, the clearest demonstration we can see of this today in reference to West Africans, right, there's a common term to describe American black people as an akata. Right, an akata is lost or stranger. Right, some of this is discussed in Sadia Hartman's book, Lose Your Mother. Right, this is also another Afro-Pest author, right, who has, demonstrated in a lot of Wilderson's work that he's just like the best control C person possible. But Sadia Hartman provides the credence of even if we went back home as black people, we can still be identified as black people, not African. And it's not a question of are there black Africans? Yes, there are. It's a subject location. But even on the continent, replaced with some of the same cultural values in which we're supposed to be endemic to, we can still feel a lost one. Right? Like we can still not be at home, be in that natal state where we are alienated from our home being, our home continent, our home culture. Right? Like we don't speak a particular language. We don't think in particular ways, like we're not endemic to philosophy. Right? Like all of these things are important to creating one's ontology. This is why, when Wilderson has a discussion, like it's of an ontological register. He's trying to say that that being or that existence could coexist or be relevant, right? Like be honored, right? In its dishonorable form, but be honored, right? Because Orlando Patterson discusses historically, right, what a slave was redeemable until a certain point, right? Like there's a whole bunch of civilizations that had slaves, and their capacity for that slave was reserved for a specific grammar of suffering. Like you had to do this for a certain amount of time. You were either, the black sheep. I don't really like saying that because it's a racist term. But like, you were, even black folk, still racist, I got that. Exile, there we go, ha! And I was just like, but like, when you were removed, exiled from your existence, right, like you were no longer you were duly stripped of your name, like you were unable to possess babies, right, like you had things for the culture, right, you had cattle, right, but you weren't able to own your own. Demonstration, we can look at Frederick Douglass's narrative. He didn't know how old he was. He seen his mom very young, but she wasn't even able to possess him as a mother because she couldn't stop the violence that happened to him, right? Like she also couldn't stop, like she couldn't raise him. She just existed next to him, right? You look at his second narrative, he's very descriptive about dispositioning right? That gives you some insight about how some of this gratuitous violence happened, even very subtle in it, right? Like it wasn't a question, it got subtle down. It was subtle in it. If my whole name is Frederick Douglass, he said, when I go to work, my name is Freddie. My name is Freddie because I work with a child who cannot he cannot pronounce Frederick or Frederick or any variation of my name. So my name is Freddie when I go to work. Freddie, could you teach me? Freddie, could you be my friend? Freddie, can we go here? When can Freddie be Freddie for Freddie? But he becomes Frederick again. This kind of concept for him is a question in which by name he was dispossessed, and the name wasn't even his. Right? That kind of violence, right, is one is demonstrated by its gratuitous nature. Now, not to say that that is the pure example, right? But as a demonstration of that robbery, right? Like that robbing of self. Right? Naim Akbar says that it is the ultimate demonstration of anti-self mechanisms when you cannot call yourself by your own name in public. Right? But these kind of concepts, right? Like we're abstracting them out, of course, like Wilderson would, but I guess I can finish there, right? A lot of how Wilderson gets to the slave, we'll discuss even some of the real-life examples about how this exists, right? A lot of people have secondary questions to, for example, where does everyone else fit, right? What is it? The second book, Red, Black, and White, talks about some of the other relationships that this object can have with the world. I know it's weird to say it like that, but he weird. I don't really know what to say. But getting to that point, I remember sitting at a debate tournament, and I guess this was like maybe my senior year or something. I'm sitting down with some beauty of kids, and they're like, "Hey, you talk all about these black people. That's cool, but what about us? We ain't quite black, but we ain't black, or we black-skinned, right?" Shout out to Joe the dude, he remember. But there was a question in which they were asking, what about them, and they weren't the blackest people in the room. This includes a little black boy who was like, I don't even know, yo, I'm mixed. I was like, what does that mean?
I get my check.
Huh?
I get my check.
You good? Okay, cool, that's what's but this narrative was complicated, right? I'm sitting in the room, I'm like maybe 2 years into the Wildersonian lit, and I mean, I talked to Frank once in public. I was like, oh, this was cool, man. I was a fan. I was fanboy. Like, I really wasn't talking about nothing. Right? And so, like, I'm very young. And so they asked me, but all I got to point is to every time Wilderson discusses this question of junior partners. Like, what do I do? And like, well, I mean, at the time I was also running a combination of some black nationalist lit, which was I would like to think, the basis of Wildersonian thinking. Right? Like he's thinking about how to create structures that are safe, if they could be, for people of color, but primarily black folks, because it's dangerous. It's a unique thing affecting. Right? When I'm thinking about that and all those things, I'm like, what am I really going to say? Things like, what are we supposed to do? And I'm like, well, be pro-black. Right? Pro-black does not mean all the things that we attach blackness to today. Right? You can see a particular brand of suffering because you know the lit. Right? This means that you have a particular response, an ethical claim. Right? Wilderson says it's unethical to have slaves in the land of the free. Right? This is an ethics DA that I cut. That's in the was it Red, Black, and White? That's extensive. It's like I think it's like 2-3 pages. But we used to scrape people on, yo, you talk about humans, that's cool, but what about the slaves? And they go, humans are slaves. We're saving everybody. Distinction. You thought that you could have a society without these slaves. We have a democracy. And these slaves, and you talk about doing all of this wonderful thing for people to train freedom. Well, now how I know you're going to keep the slaves? FEMA approved. 9 months after FEMA, there was a mudslide in San Diego, and you got all of them people out. Plus all of that breaking down. There's folks right now who still living in trailers because of FEMA's mess up of the tool. It's like, what? And then really it was a redistribution of the land. So all the older black folks who actually owned that land and all those other people of color who were there got washed away. So what's up now? You can't say that it's an equal distribution when there's a common narrative in our country that says that, wow, people who look like me are second-class citizens. And then people who kind of look like me gotta fly while being Arab, like, or walk while Mexican. Like, these are all crazy stereotypes that are now, as Sexton would call it, chain of equivalence, right? Like, to blackness, how they have to have, they find a safety net almost, right? A location of the realm of suffering right next to blackness, how close to blackness you become, you then see what suffering really is. It's an archetype, right? That's what Wilderson says, right? Like, an archetype for suffering is closest to the blackness because it values everything else, right? Even in this discussion of the native, it's like, I mean, yeah, cool. Yeah, they stripped you of your land even while you were on your land. Yup, that sucked, yo. He agrees. He also thinks that, like, for example, all you Wildersonian people who run that without talking about the red, there's a double turn. There's a turn in there because he said those are relationships that are antagonisms. You just can't fight one antagonism, right? An antagonism. There's a whole bunch of labels to describe an antagonism, but I would like, yes?
So running that, you have to also follow
I mean, if I was a good debater, I would probably Ricky Bobby it, right? Meaning do it at the same time or make it so that it got levels to it, right? But I think that it's not only most strategic, we see this with Vermont PB this year, but like it's a question of like, well, yo, if the folks know better on the app, they would just say you exclude the other antagonism that makes your world possible. They would literally ask you, so what land you standing on? Cool. An imperialist like colony or project and you talking about you can solve? That's great again. And you talking about you had a paradigmatic analysis and you left out the native? That's wild. Woo! It seems like you got a sovereignty deficit on you. Like it's just like put on the spot, like what about those people? That argument becomes structural when you read the rest of Red, Black, and White, where like he goes in at the things like the first two chapters, you'll go in about how there's a correlated relationship to those grandmas suffering inside of an American context because of how, I mean, those relationships even had to share. It's like what? Slaves ran to natives to be free at times, but then also had a complicated one where like natives were forced to buy and sell slaves for either their own gain or like to cover figure from white folks. Like all that whole narrative is complicated. It's like, well, look, when white people got access to buy their way into native land, that means that like literally they can be fungible, but in a way in which that was civil. That was the buying project that they had. Like they went to reservations and they was like, well, we'll get you land breaks. This was part of the, so like some of these reverse treaties. Right? And they was like, oh yeah, we get land. As long as you're native. Cool, then you have buckets of white people. I'll pay you $20. And it's on the list. And it's wild. It's like $20 was a lot back then. But they on the list now. And it's like, well, if that's true, it's like, well, we had to ask ourselves, some of you had to pay to get to be that way. It just had to be like that. Right? But those relationships are particular and complicated. Right? And so, all you people who here get back the land and you're running against the Wilderson business and they ask, yeah, of course you can ask, what about the black people? But if they literally spot you like, what about the red people? You should probably lose. Right? Because they can easily add a 2AC discussion about why they shouldn't have been first, but they're important to the discussion. A 1MC can't do that. Right? Like what? The 2AC gonna be like, oh, yeah, we got the red people. Too late. 2AC spoke already and jammed you up for it. Now you have to spend your whole life defending why the 1MC excluded the red people. And there's relationships that are complicated, but I think that like people who are running anti-blackness have to discuss what geography actually means in that context, right? Because you couldn't tell me what a native like Jamaican looked like. Like native meaning before the slaves. You can't. Like most people don't think about that. It's like what? No. Right? And then a whole bunch of them islands, you can't tell me what those natives look like. You can tell me what all of them slaves look like. Can't tell me not in their land. It's like, oh, wow, that's a problem. Right? Like, especially when we're looking for cultural reasons. This is why Wilderson airs on the political dynamics versus cultural. Any questions this far? How much this is kind of cool. Okay. Yes.
Can you explain more about the criticism from Sexton about the project around us?
I actually just cut this for this topic in an anti-blackness case at MGW. But it was a lot, like, all right, so like, Sexton's discussion, and this is in amalgamation schemes, right? Like, his last chapter, he's discussing this multiracial project where there's an organization to be able to discuss worldly issues, right, amongst brown people, but it's in a project that we can divorce blackness from those brown people, or their relationships to blackness, for example. And I like to get like, I guess kind of current day relevant. We can look at the Gaddafi situation, right? And they identified Gaddafi and said, hey, Hillary Clinton got on TV and was like, we're gonna kill him. They had a week to kill him, right? We look at what he was doing. His political organization took all of these brown people, right? Because we obscure what brownness is, whether it be Spanish brown or Arab brown, we don't really know, right? And that's the project, right? That obscureness allows you to be able to have projects in Latin America, but then also have projects in Asia, for example, because all of those are still brown people, right? Those Pacific Islanders are still brown people, right? Like that obscuring is one in which you can group them for categorization, right? And then it says that how can we produce those folks to be against or anti-black in their political reforms? And so we look at Egypt with Mubarak. He declared that, hey, I'm black, even though I'm Arab. People were like, no, that's not cool, right? Gaddafi did the same thing, and that's how he was able to unify folks underneath this like new currency. Like you've seen it where he organized the biggest gold backing in the globe, right? As a collection of countries to be able to control how capital got, globally distributed, right? Like that was his thing. They killed him a week before it happened. Like most people say coincidence, I don't really care. Right? I think that that's a demonstration of politics, given the fact that, for example, what they call insurgencies in that same battle, right? And you can see this on YouTube, right? Those insurgents were darker folk. It's like, what? Really? Right? Like the ones who were chilling with Gaddafi, like all of them were darker folk. But then you see Al-Qaeda next to NATO, all of those are lighter folk, Arabs, who are coming to take over. It's a question of like, yes, can we get those people out of here? There was no white people, right? Like when Wilderson discusses this, and he had a radio interview talking about the demonstrations of anti-blackness when he went over to Egypt. And he was discussing that like, yeah, even if we got rid of the question of, all right, if all the white people were gone today, there would still be a question of anti-blackness because of how it gets ingrained into the culture. Like if we look at the first people who enslaved Africans, it wasn't white folks. They couldn't even make it into Africa. Like you see in their literature, it was a question of like, malaria was killing them. It was the white man's graveyard. Who was Islam was real at that time, right? And they were literally infidel. Let's go get them. Right? Like y'all don't practice the book. Y'all don't know. Let's go get them. Right? And I mean, literally, country after country, inroads. They survived a couple things because we also know some of the descendants were like, where's the current day Turkey? Right, like Istanbul, but you also know that that's the other hub of people who are genetically produced to escape malaria. So yes, they were like genetically allowed to be able to trench into Africa. Unlike the white people who were on the coast. But like they don't have their, instantiation into what we consider like enslavable Africa until they are on the coast of, Lagos, right? Like that major country. Like major city. It's like, really? Like, and they came to a ghost town. Like literally those people were gone. They thought that there was something wrong with like the area. It was hot. No, they heard you were coming months ago. But these are discussions in which it's like, yeah, we know who took over what. We see that with South Africa in particular. It's like, really? We know that changed hands with the Dutch, but like, that's because the invaders changed hands. Not because who established that. And we know in the most northern tip, like when they started the bordering of the gerrymandering, I like to say, like the African scramble, if you will, you see that they got cut off and like all the ethnic people who were trapped in the north, also down today bound to like all of these stringent practicing rules that they can't migrate and like are trapped in tourism. It's like, well, why? Because you are our odyssey. This is supposed to be the unconquerable land. We learned that with like the Miles in Kenya. Same thing, right? Like, any land that got occupied by blackness, right? Those political regimes that can't be identified, can't be statified, they were literally like, nope. Like black political insurgency was considered the wrongest political formation possible. This is one of like the answers that we had to, you know, what is it, T and or framework. You must have a plan. What is a plan? Something that's political. What is political? And they read like a piece of box evidence or something. It's like, I mean, I guess that was cute. But like, why isn't my life or death a political decision? Right? Because if I have to live in a life and death situation, and that's co-constituted by the positioning that my body inhibits in this particular culture, this scheme of things, then it's problematic. But to bring it back down to like the Brown effect, right? It's a question of, that's how we get Latinization in Latin America, right? Like how we organize even the countries on pigmentocracy, right? Like that Brown effect is one in which, okay, we look at people who did not buy into those brown politics regardless of their skin complexion, and we see there's a problem with all of those darker people, right? And we see a question of access. It's not a question of do you have darker people in power when there's a brown country. It's a question of who populates most of it. Who's the idols for what's pretty? What aesthetic value are you appreciating? What is the symbolic nature in which we understand this, right? If we go back to Incognito, Wilderson talks about how like it's a symbolic imaginary investment. Right? Like at the level of the imaginary, can we displace these symbolic measures to be able to map on to these categories? Was that sufficient? But yeah, if you're going to take my word on it, go look up amalgamation schemes, the last chapter is extensive. There's a whole bunch of discussions about this mixing, right? How mixing is a project to be able to produce this Brown effect, because some like the other parts of the book is talking about, for example, this mulatto, right? Like that's saying it's a part of a larger project of that Browning effect. Like it's different demonstrations, but it's a question of which if we can produce the brown, it's a devaluing of the black at its thesis.
Did you call it amalgamation schemes?
Yep, by Jared Sessions.
Did you say that Gaddafi was opposed to issuing coinage for the
Yes.
Pan-African movement?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah, we read a whole ad about it. It was kind of like, that was our demonstration in current politics at the time, to be like, we can wield or exercise extreme notions of, like, you know, more than just abstract violence to how anti-blackness play out in everyday life. Like people say, like black and black crime is a demonstration of anti-black violence. I actually think that it's not true. Right? Like I think that a better demonstration of how the label black on black crime gets used in black areas to prove that how they're mass killing themselves is a demonstration of their being violent endemically. Right? That is a demonstration of anti-black violence, not that black people could be shooting themselves. It's like people shoot everybody. It's not a question of like, did you shoot a black person today? It's like, unless it's racially charged, and everything is, but we won't admit it, no, right? Those kind of concepts are weird to me, right? If we're able to do a paradigmatic analysis, right, it allows us to abstract just a tad bit to see the mechanics, right? Because that's weird. Questions? All right. Are we good on time?
You have 45 minutes.
Okay. All right, so I'd like to get into some of the other folks who kind of, I guess, beefing up Wilderson's theory about how some of these demonstrations of violence happen. I know I was real skimp on the native section. If you have specific questions, I'll get to you. That's not really a thing. I said we don't. So, white over black and white over black only, a Farley concept. It was kind of like my favorite thing to run out of this anti-blackness stuff, actually, because it also had an education component, right? Farley was also a big fan of James Baldwin, right? And his discussion of how education works for those black bodies in particular. Like, why is there a specific need for a kind of education that is fitted for blackness, right? It is one that is I mean, James Baldwin discusses this with like, I think it's like a letter to his nephew, right? And he warns him about things that are constructing the world and are preconceived notions before his nephew did, right? Because his nephew's a baby. He's like warning him about the world, right? Paul Farley uses that demonstration as this is something that is always repeatable because this I guess map for how to mature as a black body or like a blackened body is always going to be violent. So there's things that we must be aware of. That's the gratuitous nature to the violence of blackness, right? That's germane to blackness, right? And so when we're discussing, you know, Paul Farley, he's discussing how when we move from the abolishment of slavery, it just moved to prisons. It moved to cultural perspective. So for example, we know that sharecropping wasn't a thing. But open container laws were like the easiest access, or like, you know, vagabond laws, right? Like no ID or no house, right? Were the 3 easiest laws to go to prison, right? We know that prison was not like slavery, but slavery still, like chain gangs are an important measure of this. You can see a movie with Martin Lawrence and was Eddie Murphy in Life, right? To show you some of the very vivid depictions. I just think that movie's funny, and I think that it also shows you how the demonstration of, for example, that Paul Farley will commit to. He has an online discussion where he's talking about the incarceration rates, right, of Albany, New York versus, I mean, anywhere else in the country. He says that, like, for example, black men are 800 times more likely to go to prison there, even though they're like 30% of the, like, the citizen population. It's like, what? Wow. That's wild. And we know that prison labor is bought and sold, and it's private capital at this point. So, for example, Michael Jordan can own private prisons. And he does. It's not. Yes, that's why I don't wear down his stuff. Yeah! Mind blown, look at it!
It's a weird thing to own. Like, hey,
No, it's not. It's profitable.
Like, I own shoes in a prison.
No. It's more like, I own what puts people in prison. Shoes. Ah! You ain't seen them shoe fights where they had like literally like, you know, hundreds of people out, I'm gonna get my 100 pair. It's like literally only 50 pair you sold at the store and you knew that was popping. So you exploited supply and demand, but you knew how this works because you went and fanned them. And you put out the same recycled shoe every 2 years, homie? Wild. Back to the track. Shout out George Lee. I know you wear them all the time, but you're my man. Jordan, you go ahead. I know we record this, so we're going to look at it. But when we look at some of these just modern schemes of how we can recreate anti-blackness, right? It's not just things like Jim Crow. We think that that was a thing. It was over. It's like, I mean, really? Trayvon proved, not true. Right? And by the same laws, it's right, like when we look at, was it Marissa Alexander, when she had the same stand your ground law? It's like, what? And the interpretation where you had a charging, violent ex-boyfriend, and you shot warning shots in the air, you were subjected to a 10-year, like 20-year sentence immediately. And then it was waved down, and then, like, I think it's still in limbo now, right? Like, that's wild. So you don't get a right for self-defense, like when Ida B. Wells Barnett wrote, and like, you know, her lynching tales was a question of, she had markers for like, what were the causes for lynching? Same thing. It was like, wow, did you have self-defense? It was like 7 folks, 10 folks, like just like multiple examples of people, like black folks. Self-defense is what got you lynched. It's like, wow. So it's kind of crazy because I hear that, and it's like, can I find that same demonstration, right? Because if white over black is a trajectory, and white over black only, I should be able to find the same trajectory. So when all of you folks talked about Asada last year, no one talked about why she originally went to jail. Everyone talked about, oh, picture for you from Cuba. Well, she went to jail literally for saying that same self-defense measure, which is we should be able to disband the police. Every person who said that out loud in public as a political message were locked away indefinitely because it's considered treason. Even if the police are shown statistically, empirically, historically, and right now to be abusive to those particular communities that they say that they are going to protect. That is wild. right? We know this because if we look at the work that was done studying the black belts, which are southern black communities at the turn of the century when we have slaves to be free. One, you see policing mechanisms, quarantine whole black neighborhoods, and SWAT-like formation. SWAT meaning at groups at a time, surveying and kicking open doors. But then you also see the standard issue pistol go from just a little 6-shooter to a 38, right? Like the caliber of bullet increased because then there used to be a myth about black people and drugs, right? At the turn of the century, we don't remember this because there were a whole many other scandals about how blackness becomes deviant, right? This was one in which cocaine induced workers, black workers, because we know that cocaine was used to keep people up, keep people motivated to do work, and feed them less. If you are sharecropping, this is probably something that your employer gave you. This is also true with alcohol. For slaves and or black people who were just outside slavery. Like those same kind of concepts were transient, and so it was allowed to be controlled. This is why public drunkenness becomes something that you can be locked up for over container laws, right? Like these things were easy access pipes to prison. But in those same kind of concepts, it was like, look, I paid you, and coke, and I gave you space to do your crops, and I gave you these little wooden coins to shop at my store. That was a thing. Why is that not slavery? You just control my existence and you say payment is possible because I have coins to do that. Misnomer slaves were there were slaves who were always paid. It's like people say the slaves weren't paid. That's not necessarily always true. That doesn't mean that they weren't devalued in such a way that their money didn't mean anything coming from a slave, right? Because for example, slaves couldn't look people in the face, people meaning everyone else but slaves. Couldn't look them eye to eye, so that like that dishonorable subject, even if you had the same amount of coins, you were had under suspicion, like what slave has a job, was a common thing to be said, not because slaves couldn't have jobs or they weren't working, but why should they have mobility, was the immediate question. Slaves are property of other people. They're not people, right? We know this with the 3/5 compromise. We also, and I'm just like spotting the history because a lot of these things go to make up that relationship to, once again, that social contract, right? Like people like of African descent have to have a relationship to the government because they are property of, like this has always been a thing and will be a thing. People say complications now with Obama. George James throws this and every other person who thinks that Obama is a revival tactic or could be a good thing in America. And in fact, she says this is a strategy of a dead zone and said this is problematic. Right? And that she's definitely within her right of, like, as an Afro-pessimist to just get it in. Like, she like, no. And it's because George James is talking about how, and this is also with, Dr. Shanara Reed Brinkley piece that also correlates with, she looked at, Mosley Braun and her political, campaign and compares this to a lot of the Afro-pessimist conclusions, but like ultimately they come out the same way when they're talking about how the model of blackness gets used, right, in terms of signification with particular language, right? Like we know this with Obama when he goes, Trey, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. It's like, what does that mean? Right? Some of these things are very pointed where, for example, when Mosley Braun goes, I know how to clean up politics, I'm going to get my broom and my dustpan and I'm going to sweep my magic. It's like, what? You're cleaning the White House again, Larry? Really? You don't never escape the politics? It's like, again, right? We see that those same roles are not only applicable, but vibrant, right? And the anti-blackness literature seeks to try to place this in context. To say that these roles are just roles, they're scripts to be repeated over and over again, right? We see the newest, scripting literature is from, Dr. Shanara Brinkley. She talks about ghetto kids going good. This is her anti-blackness treatment of UDLs and the media representation. It's like, those scripts are promoted to produce, and I guess this leads us into like the last little bit, which is the libido economy of Wilderson, right? Like this I love it. I got to have it, right? I don't know. I think of the libido discussion as libido meaning desire. This is like Lacan and all those business. I'll be the first one to tell you, me and Lacan are not best friends. Please don't ask me to explain him a whole bunch, because I won't. But what I'll tell you is that some of this, like libidinal desire, we can get into about how, for example, Negrophobic responses are developed. Right? Like I love, like as Wilderson said, it's a representation. I love those African things. Right? I love that African dance. I love those hip reps. I love the way that poetry, he's such articulate. Like these things, right? Are revivals of that Negrophobic response, but it's one in which those exchanges are like how we can see proper models of blackness, right? This is how we can see Sway on MTV for years, but I mean, he becomes a black representative. So does Jesse Jackson, right? Like these are comfortable figures in blackness, right? Like they become our stepstones, right? Like Clarence Thomas, all of these people, right? Like where they become the comfortable renditions. Obama becomes the comfortable rendition of a safe black dream, right? Like if you act accordingly, you can go to Yale, you can become president. You don't have to be from Hawaii, you don't have to go to the best schools, and you definitely don't have to come from a multiracial like area like Chicago and then have turmoil in the presidency where like you come from a historic background. No, you don't. You don't need any of that. You just go out, go to school and do that. Sorry, my kid. You can go out and go ahead and just do that. It's like, what? Those are the models that get mapped onto every other colored body, even if you're not black, right? That's Sexton's discussion about that, like that question of being fungible, but it's an expansive measure, right? Like an elasticity, right? Like that's Sadil Hartman's discussion about how everyone seeks to be in blackness. We can vacation in it. We can have black tropes, but don't nobody want the consequence of being black. Right, and these are like all like, yeah, I can say all language, use the N-word, but like, yeah, this, that, and the third, listen to all the music, be the highest consumers of, like Kanye said, the crack music, but literally it's like, you don't even live the lifestyle. That's kind of wild. Right, and these are consumption modules, right? And I think that like, if we're putting this into perspective, these are just comfortable spaces for blackness to exist. Comfortable spaces meaning, as long as they play by the rules, they can only be slightly structurally adjusted, right? Structurally adjusted meaning you cookie coverage or whatever they need, right? Like the professionals in this room and tell you, they have that structural adjustment every time they go to work. Especially the women who go to work, they got to deal with a whole bunch of the things. Like the men who go to work, a whole bunch of the rules, acceptable norms they have to be placed in. Wilderson don't believe in a lot of like those subject